I'm amazed that today people can say that the Confederate flag is not racist and be taken seriously and have their voice said on TV. They have a right to their opinion, but it doesn't mean their opinion is right. It was used in the Civil War, which was fought over slavery. Slavery is cited by states in their documents of secession, and all the arguments about trade and anti-tariff and states' rights all hinged on the fact of free labor. When people say it's about heritage and not hate, they fail to see that the heritage is a heritage of hate. The flag was folded for much of the time after the Civil War. It came out when there were veterans celebrations, often with both sides joining in union. But it really took popularity after the Supreme Court decided against segregated schools. That's when many southern states whose flags were already based on versions of the political flag, added the battle flag, the thing that we most commonly think of as the Confederate flag, the red flag with the blue cross and stars. It became more popular and part of the official state flags at that time. White privilege allows even the most preposterous claims to be taken seriously. Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee seduced, killed, and ate gay teens of color. A bleeding, naked Asian youth ran from his apartment into the street. A black woman told police that he was a minor and that he went to school with her child, and other black people in the neighborhood agreed with her. But the police officer did not believe her and her friends. Instead, they believed the calm white guy who said that his friend had just gotten a little drunk and that he would take him in and make sure he's okay. He wasn't okay, because the victim was released into Dahmer's custody. Yet some people insist that white privilege doesn't exist. I came across this quote by a woman named Alice Teller, who defined white privilege as being held responsible for the acts of your ancestors by a people who accept no responsibility for the acts of their children. Listen to this statement. It is shocking to me. She thinks that white privilege is only white people being held responsible for the acts of their ancestors by people who accept no responsibility for the acts of their children. The sense that everything is just fine, racism is over, why do they keep bringing it up and getting out in the street and being angry? This statement complains that whites are still being blamed for slavery, but that was over long ago. If it is over, then why are people still flying the battle flag? I saw battle flags on the caps of people who were shoving around protesters at a recent political rally. In Chicago, what is the heritage of the Confederate flag in Chicago, a Union state? Blacks are supposed to forget slavery, but whites are to never forget that the Civil War took the slaves from them. And it also suggests that black people do not hold their children accountable. But it wasn't a white guy who avoided charges for killing people by claiming that his affluent lifestyle did not teach him right from wrong. During the 1963 March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that he wanted his children to be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s made laws based on race illegal. But it did not stop people from enforcing the law in racially biased ways. The war on drugs and 3 strikes and you're out jail sentences have been disproportionately enforced upon people of color. And even though whites tend to use drugs at a higher rate, they are arrested at a lower rate, convicted at a lower rate, and serve shorter sentences. And also, many states never allow convicted felons to vote again, even after they have served their sentences. Public schools were desegregated. This led to a rise in private schools where only white kids went, or suburban schools in areas where blacks were not allowed to live. Support for public school went down as white parents insisted on lower taxes. Why should white taxes pay to educate brown kids? After World War II, the GI Bill helped many veterans get loans for schools and houses, but many colleges refused to enroll blacks, and blacks were only allowed to buy in certain areas. This led to the rise of suburbs, allowing white people to live farther from their jobs and use the state-subsidized interstate highway system. They bought homes that increased in value, while blacks were allowed to buy homes that decreased in value. After Vietnam, the draft was eliminated. Instead of people from all incomes being drafted, the volunteer army draws mostly from the poor, which is mostly minority. Yet the decision to go to war is made mostly by the white, wealthy men. Special funding is always found when it's time to go to war. But when the poor return from war, there never seems to be enough money allocated for their physical and mental health. We now live in a time where whites have plausible deniability. They no longer need to judge on the basis of skin, and they actually think they are judging on the content of character when they discriminate against criminals, the uneducated, or the poor. They never ask why people are poor and uneducated and criminals. The educational system has been decimated. Jobs have followed people to the suburbs beyond public transportation. Crack cocaine, a cheaper form of cocaine, had harsher penalties than powder cocaine that the wealthy use. Blacks were disproportionately offered variable mortgage rates, even when they were eligible for fixed interest rates. When the housing bubble burst, few of the white businessmen who wrote the rules were arrested. After all, what they did was legal. They wrote the rules. Minorities had their houses foreclosed at a higher rate, and housing prices are still underwater in minority neighborhoods while they have started to recover in white neighborhoods, which is why I still have a house in North Carolina that is not worth what I paid for it. The system has been set up and designed to disadvantage certain populations and help others. Biologically, there is no such thing as race. When scientists look and say, here's the color of skin, how is it associated with other traits such as personality and height? If you take an instance of height, within Africa, there are tribes in Sudan that are the tallest, and tribes in Uganda, which are the shortest, among the human race. When we talk about traits, health traits, that American blacks tend to have higher blood pressure and an increased risk for diabetes, that's not a racial trait. That's a trait of a specific ethnic groups, mostly from West Africa, who lived under a particular system of oppression, who learned that when you had to eat the garbage of the white people, it all tasted better if you deep fried it. And they still deep fry a lot more than white people, and they suffer the consequences from it. The Pope in the 16th century declared that Christians could conquer the heathen and claim any land they conquered. The Christians happened to have lighter skin. They associated this with purity and goodness. Race is a social construct. It was created in this time as a pseudo-scientific construct. But when you think of it, all human skin is a shade of brown. But in order for supposed scientific classifications, people were determined to be red, yellow, black, or white. At first, in Virginia, white and black servants were allowed to marry. But after it appeared that the servant class outnumbered the wealthy class, and the poor were angry, and they outnumbered the rich, skin color was used to divide. At first, most servants were given freedom after 7 years. Then that benefit was only given to whites. They said they would give it to Christians, which didn't include Catholics, the Irish. And of course, even if a black person converted to Christianity, they weren't considered a Christian. Militias were needed to prevent slave uprisings. White men were expected to be armed and ready and called into action in case there was a slave insurrection. And Patrick Henry feared that the federal Constitution would mean that states would lose the right to organize the state militia. And the Second Amendment was passed, so the Constitution could be passed. White militias can hold a standoff against federal agencies. They are given plenty of time to surrender, and only one person gets killed. And one person didn't get arrested until 2 years after the standoff. But a 12-year-old boy with a toy gun is given 2 seconds in Cleveland before he is shot dead. Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States until 1925. Many were killed and had their land stolen. Even today, white men are going on reservations and raping Native women, and the cases remain unsolved because the white police departments surrounding the reservation do not pursue suspects for crimes outside their jurisdiction, and they don't cooperate with the Native police. But it's not all about race. The issue of race intersects with other oppressions. The most notable of these is gender. After the Civil War, black men were allowed to vote. White and black women had to wait another 60 years. Being male is a strong privilege indeed. But it is not without its cost to many men. Men are to compete. If they lose, they are denigrated as weak and effeminate. They may even be called the name of female genitalia on a political stage to humiliate people. That's why homosexuality is such a threat. If sexual relations are between men who have equal status, it upsets the hierarchical system. If women choose to enter into an equal partnership with another woman, they too are resisting the system by ignoring it. Interracial marriages also disrupt the social order. White women belong to white men. A married woman wasn't allowed to get a credit card in her name in the United States until 1974. A woman did not have a right to say no to her husband if he wanted sex. I can't remember the case, but it was sometime in the 80s. This concept of women as property, white women as property of white men, it must be protected from the black men who are portrayed as hypersexual and violent. Black women are also hypersexualized. They were slaves to be used by men of privilege, but not worth marrying. Thomas Jefferson did not marry his first wife's half-sister because the other half of her was black. One married white women for many years to get access to father's property. Marriage for many years was a gentleman's agreement among fathers. White women were property meant to be demure and pure. Black women were property meant to be wild and sexy. Beyonce earns her money by portraying the white man's fantasy. And many white men got upset when she performed a song at the Super Bowl where she portrayed racial pride and suggested that she owned her own body and could dance any way she wanted to. Thank you. The competitive male system also hurts men who cannot rise to the top. The poor are sent to the front lines at the whim of parlor generals. And white men who are at the bottom of the hierarchy are assigned a color. The pejorative term redneck. And among some white culture, some people have taken that pejorative term and tried and used it as a badge of honor. You might be a redneck if. And yet they don't understand why black people who are also called a disparaging word sometimes claim that word and say it proudly. And why, when I was young, the word queer was a word that you weren't supposed to say. And now a significant amount of the trans population especially wear it as a badge of honor, taking a negative word and trying to reclaim it. So those white men and women who are called rednecks tend to be more resistant to equal rights based on gender, race, and sexuality. You would think there would be compassion because they're in the same boat, but that's precisely the thing. Race has been used to keep them separate from their natural allies in this country. They have lost the competition in the major leagues and do not want to be sent down to the minors with the minorities. The brash, rich, heterosexual white male bully says, "Join me or become part of the loser class." And many prefer to be on the low rung of the ladder of privilege than to be spread evenly across the ground like all those who are forbidden to be on the ladder and who are stepped upon. In a system of inequality, it is always better to be higher. We either learn to work the system or we work to change the system. When the NAACP was formed, there was a real debate in the black community and the white community about what was the best way to proceed. It was represented by two men, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington did incredible work in teaching freed slaves how to make do in a rigged system. He emphasized people going into the trades, and if people need their plumbing fixed, they will use a black man if they're desperate enough. If you have the skills, all these skilled trades, you might be able to work your way as a tradesman in this racist community. But W.E. Du Bois said, we shouldn't adapt to the racist system. We should change the system by educating and transforming it. And Mary White Ovington, a Unitarian who was often called the founding mother of the NAACP, the first secretary, she insisted that W.E. Du Bois write their journal of the NAACP. So it wasn't an organization about helping people cope with an inadequate system, that it would be an organization that tried to change the system. I was born a white male, raised a Christian, discovered that I was heterosexual. My family was middle class and able to send me to college. So basically, I have lived a life of privilege. There are two choices that I've made that have given me a taste of the other side. One is that I chose this religion. And I no longer consider myself a Christian. So I can't fill out that little square on my privilege bingo. I'm not thin. My wife thinks I'm attractive, and so I'm going to mark that one, because that's the only one who counts. And that's the second thing that I've done in my life. I had no choice about falling in love with her. We spent about 5 years pursuing more socially conventional partnerships as best friends, and then would each talk to each other about the strange people we were dating. Finally, we figured it out. I've had the experience of being stared at in public, being stopped by the police for no reason, being searched at the Canadian border as white families drove by, being in a car chase with racists who were shouting epithets at us and trying to run us off the road. This happened in Indiana by the Indiana Dunes. I told my son he could not wear a baseball cap because he might be mistaken for a gang member. When we looked for housing, we were often shown houses only in the black part of town. I might not have even been aware that these things happen in the world. I would have been unaware of the privilege I walk around with. But I do not feel guilty about having privilege. Any of us who have privilege can exercise it on behalf of those with less. As a white male, I have more freedom to speak on feminism and race, and know that I'm more likely to be listened to because people won't dismiss me as just trying to get over and get my edge. Justice is love in action. It is using what you got in any way you can And if you find that you do not belong to any privileged class, you have a knowledge of how the system works that you can share. That's why James Weldon Johnson wrote, "Black America is called upon to stand as protagonists of tolerance, of fair play, of justice and goodwill. White America cannot save itself if it prevents us from being saved." And it's also true if you are a sexual minority, a religious minority, or an economic minority. We don't see the privilege that we have. Fish in water feel superior to birds, bugs, and mammals who do not swim as well. They do not need to develop a strategy for surviving the system. White people don't need to develop a strategy for surviving the system. You go to school, you get good grades, you go to college, you get a job. That's what's supposed to happen. Fish do not need to develop a strategy for surviving the system. The water just flows past their gills. They can't understand why whales surface. They look at whales and say, "Whales are just weird." Likewise, one cannot see the privilege one has unless one looks. The Standing on the Side of Love movement in the UU religion has taken an interesting stance, led by people who know that the system that oppresses, led by people who know about the system that oppresses. So often as privileged people, we have gone to the underprivileged as experts with our own solutions. But we have learned with the immigration struggle that we should listen to the people in the struggle. And we should listen to Black Lives Matter and the issues of police brutality. And we listen to the stories of sexual minorities. Love is not patronizing. Justice is not a top-down affair. We do not help by trying to fix people broken by the system. We help when we work with them to fix a broken system. I see that I have gone to my time. I'm going to blame the clocks changing for throwing me off. Couldn't possibly be that I'm long-winded. So I do invite people to do a congregational response, to participate in this with me. Go get your coffee after service. Come back and join me up here on the stage. And we'll talk and we'll think about 4 questions and take time to do it. First, we'll check in and see how people are feeling. And then each of us will have the opportunity to count our struggles. In what way have we felt underprivileged? And then secondly, how do our struggles inform our quest for justice? And then to count our blessings. In what ways do we feel privileged? And then finally, how can we use our privilege in our quest for justice? The work is never done. At every point in history when a solution has been raised, you climb a hill, and that allows you to see problems you never even imagined. So let us continue this work for justice, for an equal society, for equity, knowing that it probably will not be accomplished in our lifetime. Susan B. Anthony died before she got the right to vote. but we're always trying to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.